Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation, Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode will speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back. My next guest, Debbie Sykes, joined me from Nashville via Zoom. In 2016, Debbie founded the Nashville Wildlife Conservation Center, a nonprofit dedicated to help the community connect, conserve, and coexist with nature. They do this through education using ambassador animals and also wildlife rehabilitation. We had a fascinating conversation about white-tailed deer, one of her specialties in wildlife rehab. To kick things off, I asked her when and how she became interested in caring for white-tailed deer.
In about 2005 or 2006, it started with an ecology course in college, and we had a professor that took us on a field trip to Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center in California. Most of the people were uninterested, but I was kind of obsessed with all of these different animals and ended up volunteering there for a year before I transferred to Northern Arizona University. Once I graduated there, I moved to Nashville and found Walden's Puddle. They are the biggest wildlife rehabilitation center in Tennessee. And I started as a volunteer, was hired on in May of 2012 and worked there until 2019. So from 2012 to 2019, I worked pretty heavily with the fawn. And then in 2016, I started a wildlife education center that, since leaving Walden's Puddle in 2019, is now a wildlife rehabilitation center. We focus mainly on turtles, but also do small and large mammals.
And what is that organization called?
Nashville Wildlife Conservation Center.
Love it. Love it. Straight to the point. And so one of the things that I thought we should start with to talk about wildlife rehabilitation in regards to white-tailed deer and deer fawns in particular is to talk about natural history. Because from my perspective, I do think that natural history is probably the most important piece in wildlife rehabilitation, that it actually can tell you a lot about how to care for an animal. So let's start there. Talk about white-tailed deer natural history.
Great. I think for me, when I was doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of hunters and biologists, the main chunk of what we talked about was their digestive system and nutrition, which I know we'll get a little bit more into. But I think the biggest thing for them is that 4-chambered stomach. Mm-hmm. So they've got the rumen, the reticulum, omasum, abomasum, and then of course the small and large intestine. And really, if you look at the adaptation they have to eating plants, right? So most of their nutrition, they're eating plants. It's full of cellulose, hemicellulose, and we know no mammal has enzymes to digest all of that. So they've developed this amazing adaptation with microflora in that four-chambered system to help them digest that food. And so just that whole, I think that is the most exciting thing about deer. And I could talk about this for 2 hours.
Well, we are going to delve into this, not just later, but even now, before we get into are they diurnal or nocturnal or that kind of thing too, because I do think that part is really interesting and very important. So keep going.
Great. Of course, we know they eat the plants, whether it's browse, forbs, grasses, and they masticate it just a little bit. So their teeth are specially designed to do that kind of scissor thing, but they don't masticate it too much. So they just kind of eat, and then swallow. And that rumen is meant to just be that good storage facility, so that they've developed this technique for anti-predation. Basically, they're not sitting in a field all day waiting to be predated upon. Yeah. Right. Okay. So they can eat quickly and then go and digest later. Once they're in that safe spot, they regurgitate, they chew the cud, and they're able to masticate a little bit more. Not only that, but they're getting saliva on it. And their saliva is really cool because it is salty. It's got, it's basic, which is important for the digestion. Once they masticate it a little bit more, they swallow it. And the rumen and the reticulum, they're kind of connected so that a lot of the digestion, or the fermentation rather, is happening all the time. But by chewing it up a little bit more, they're able to give the microbes more stuff to ferment. There's a better surface area. And you're looking at bacteria and protozoa mainly. One thing that I think is so interesting is coccidia is part of their natural microflora. That's something that we look a lot when we're doing fecals for any animal and usually treat, but for them, it's a natural protozoa. So once they're able to ferment these pieces down, they can pass through the omasum. The omasum it kind of looks like a lot of folds. And so it's really hard for bigger particles to get through. So you're only getting the smaller particles through. And from there, it helps with, the omasum helps to get those smaller particles through, and also to kind of soak in some of the fluid. It's more basic. For those that don't know, in order for fermentation to happen, it needs to be in a basic pH and anaerobic environments. So it helps take that basic pH away. The stuff passes through and goes into the abomasum, which is more like the stomach. So it's an acidic environment. So that omasum is separating the acidic environment from the basic environment. And then from there, you have the regular kind of stomach part of it. So acts as a stomach, then goes through the small intestine, large intestine, and so on.
You mentioned that the saliva was salty.
Yes.
And it is basic, yeah. You said, and that's strictly or to help with the fermentation.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that was, because it wasn't completely clear in my brain, so I wanted to make sure that it was clear. So awesome. Okay, about how much do these an adult, for example, or maybe even a fawn, once it's eating solids, how much do they have to eat in a day?
Oh, what a great question, Gail. What do you think?
I would imagine it depends on what their activity level is.
And the season, of course.
And the season, right. But, so like I have a horse. So horses don't have a four-chambered stomach, but and they're rear gut fermenters. So they need to eat many hours throughout the day. So maybe it's not the exact amount, although we have amounts that we can estimate for hay in the wintertime, but maybe it's the amount of time. I mean, do they need to eat a certain amount of time throughout the day or night? Because otherwise their stomach becomes too acidic, because horses can certainly get ulcers because they're not eating enough. So is it similar? Probably not, since it's the
four chambered versus that. As far as the acidic is concerned, usually it's only if they're eating a lot of carbs that can be easily digestible, and so the microflora in their stomach, they're getting too much carbs, so that will make the environment a little bit more acidic.
Okay.
But as far as eating, they're grazing usually throughout the day whenever they get a chance, because they're prey animals. So, they're during their high activity times, that's where you'll find them grazing, browsing.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. So what else? So that four-chamber stomach helps with, because they're a prey animal. And so it really helps. I can eat and run. I can eat, and then I can digest later. And there's several animals out there, several species of animals that are similar to that. Other species, I know of some birds and other things, not with four-chambered stomachs again, but with a storage system, so they can eat and go sit and digest a little later. So that's very interesting. And then what else about white-tailed deer natural history?
Yeah. Well, so I do, not to be a dead horse, which is a terrible thing to say to a horse owner, but along with the four-chambered stomach, fawns have developed an adaptation that allows the formula. It's not called formula, it's called milk, when you're dealing with a real animal.
Oh, we are talking to rehabilitators, so they get it, they understand.
So when they suckle, it activates this reticular groove, so that can bypass the first couple chambers. That way they're not losing energy to the bacteria and protozoa digesting it. So they can kind of slip right through it. That's another amazing adaptation with that digestive system.
Does that disappear when they get older? Or does that just stay there and it just doesn't get used?
Yeah, since they don't suckle a lot. They're suckling on tails and stuff, but not when they eat. So it okay. Seems like it's mainly just activated through the suckling. And I know their stomach does change with the season, so intestines get smaller, larger, depending on what season it is, which is crazy to think about. But along with that, their diet changes as well. So who knows? I'm sure they do know which if it's the chicken or the egg, does it change to accommodate all these different things, or do they accommodate all these different things because of the change? Did I say that right?
You said that very good. It was very well. Yeah, that was fine. So
yeah, of course their food selection depends on the time of year. Just like with horses, the grass is sweeter in the spring than it is a little bit later as the grass starts to grow. So their plant preferences change, but then also what's available. We have the masts, the oak nuts, different things like that come out in the fall. I did find out through talking to a lot of the biologists here in Tennessee that they call them acorns instead of acorns. So I thought that was really interesting.
Okay, I wonder why that is.
So they eat a lot of acorns in the fall. And we know that that's about it for diet, right?
Yeah. Well, and we can revisit that as we go along, because certainly we're going to talk about that later when it comes to the rehabilitation of fawns. So where in Tennessee, for example, where would you find white-tailed deer?
Literally everywhere. I'm near the city. We have white-tailed deer walking by all the time. I'm not sure if it's the same for y'all in Minnesota.
In Minnesota, yeah. Yes, we have a lot of white-tailed deer and a lot of different, the habitats, have some of the same features, but they're pretty adaptable animals, and they've certainly adapted very well to humans, partly because of where they like to browse and eat. And during hunting season too, places where there's more humans, they learn pretty quickly is pretty safe. So So what kind of habitats are you finding them in?
In Tennessee, I mean, we have a lot of forests, a lot of grassland. Well, not as many grasslands as we used to, unfortunately, but really just anywhere. They thrive on forbs. They thrive even on, invasive honeysuckle here. That's one of their food sources in the early spring. And, there's just a lot of that everywhere, along with, of course, people's roses, any type of gardening. And it depends. So their home range really depends on the site fidelity, so to speak. But if there's a lot of these delicious forbs, acorns, hickory nut, well, yeah, maybe not hickory nuts, but what am I trying to say?
Yeah, the types of habitat, or if their home range, right?
Yeah.
If is their home range, my guesses would be smaller if you've got a lot more food, and bigger if there's a lot less food.
Depending on the season, of course.
Depending on the season. Okay. Yeah. And also here in Minnesota, I mean, white-tailed deer definitely like low browse, right? So you don't find them in very mature forests, for example, because there's not a lot of bushes or smaller trees growing or anything like that, because there's not as much light. So they definitely like that mixed deciduous kind of forest. So they have a lot of those lower forbs, and certainly grasslands or edge, they can go out and eat in that meadow, and then they can go hide in the woods if they need to. But of course, I don't think in Tennessee you get as much snow as we do in Minnesota, but they certainly have, unless it's very, very deep snow, they actually don't have much trouble negotiating the snow and the cold winters that we can have. And I do know that deer can go a fairly long time without eating in the wintertime, and they survive just fine. So,
and I know they can migrate not very far, but in Minnesota, since it's so cold, do you see that at all? I know in Pennsylvania they've recorded it.
Yeah, there is a little bit of that. So it's not like a full migration like you would see a bird going from, North America down to the southern part of South America, that kind of migration. But in northern Minnesota along Lake Superior, and deer have expanded their range into that area because of logging that happened 150 to 200 years ago. But during the wintertime, a lot of the white-tailed deer will move down closer to the lake, partly because there's a big highway there and it's all clear, so it's easier to move, but also easier to get water because the lake doesn't always freeze.
Yeah.
And it's warmer by the lake in the wintertime. So they move down, and that, of course, and we'll talk about this later, the challenges that deer face. Cars are a huge challenge for white-tailed deer, and vice versa, right? A lot of that unfortunate interaction. And then in the summertime, spring and summer, then they move back a little bit farther north and away from the lake, because a lot of people, of course, want to be by the lake too. So a lot of activity in the summertime by people means that the deer will move farther north. So there's a little bit of that that kind of migration that goes back and forth.
Yeah. And we don't have to, obviously we don't worry about that here. It's the same deer that visits my front yard every single day, rain, shine, snow, whatever. So It's never too cold for them to have to migrate, or their home range doesn't really move too much based off of the seasons here.
Right. Okay. So what else can you tell me about either some of their adaptations or natural history?
One of the things that's, I'm going to say this a lot, one of the things, something that's very important is also their social structure. Next to, moose are very solitary, but they also congregate in pretty low numbers. You'll see them basically anywhere from 2 to 12. That changes during the season. So in the non-breeding seasons, the the males will kind of congregate and hang out together. And then the females will hang out together until fawning season happens. And then they'll be a little bit more solitary, but then they'll come together. The females tend to be more family structured, moms and her offspring. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you would expect, the males tend to go a little bit farther from their home range at the first year. So they'll start out with mom and then maybe travel into a group of bucks after their first year. So
then young does that they're not a breeding age or whatever yet, do they stick with mom for 2 years, 1 year? Is it the same kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, they'll stick with their mom. We watch them pretty heavily here, just specifically for rehab purposes. I like to know their social structure. But the ones in our neighborhood at the nearby park and over by the city, that we've seen the same mom and her does for the last 3 or 4 years now. Wow. So they'll have babies, they'll kind of break apart, but then you'll see a little bit of a bigger group come together in the late fall. Okay. You can always usually tell the age based off of how big they are.
Right. So maybe we won't get in depth on fawns quite yet and what, their behaviors and signals back and forth, but we'll stick with just in general deer. So as far as a few of the physical adaptations that help them with their social structure, like for example, sense of smell or marking a territory, mm-hmm. or hearing and ears and eyesight and things like that. How does that all kind of mesh together?
Yeah, well, you just said it pretty much. So they do have that olfaction, right? So they're sensing. They have the chemicals where they'll kind of rub up, and they're very visual. So also, looking at their ears, you can, just like with dogs, horses, any animal, I guess they display that aggression with their ears down, staring at another deer. But really, their sense of smell is acute. Their hearing is great. That's
so as far as marking like territory, do they all do it? Or is it just bucks in the fall? Because certainly bucks do it, right? I know that they have a scent gland by their eye and they will rub up against, branches and things like that. Mm-hmm. And there's also a scent gland in between the hoof.
The hooves, the forehead.
So there's a couple different places where they mark. And of course, when they're just walking, they're kind of putting their calling card down as they walk. So everybody knows that who's who. So voice, they've got a good sense of hearing that helps them, figure out if deer, maybe I'm getting onto fawns now anyway, because I have lots of questions, of course, about fawns, but how does mom recognize their baby? Is it through smell? Is it through sound?
They definitely do the sound, when they're in trouble. As far as, I know you know this, but we know they leave them for 12 hours in a certain area. The babies don't have that sense of smell so that they don't attract predators.
Meaning that they physically don't have an odor.
Yes. Sorry. They do not have an odor. Just like with bunnies, they're not going to be easily detected by predators. They sit very still. They have good memories.
Oh, so they basically remember, partly they remember where the kid is. Of course, it's not a kid, it's a fawn. But and probably not sense of smell, but hey, I know this is my fawn because this is where I left it.
I mean, although, there has been some wild fostering happening where you play the help me call and you give the mom, she had one fawn and now there's another one that shows up and she accepts that one. So who knows, they might be not as smart as we think.
or they're not as particular, right? I mean, other animals will totally reject other young and favor of their own, but then some will adopt.
Yeah. And we do know in the wild, if it happens, sometimes one of the siblings will take it in if the mom dies, but.
Interesting. That's really interesting. What about other behavioral cues? Like I see danger. What do I do if I'm a deer?
They freeze mainly, right? So they either freeze or take off. And now you'll see that quite often. I mean, everybody talks about it, deer in the headlights. I get that every night driving home. If all of a sudden I'm thinking about something else and I see a bright flash of light, I get very confused for a second. But they've got that fight or flight? Nope. Flight or freeze. There we go.
Fight, flight, or freeze.
There we go. Yeah, that's what they're doing. They're flighting or they're freezing. They're very rare. They're very rarely fighting. Yeah, unless it's a mom, somebody is coming close to her doe, she will kick them. And we see that quite often in the parks. I say quite often, maybe once, twice a year, it'll happen where somebody and their dog will get too close to fawn and the doe will kick them. And it's not a light kick either. So
right.
Be powerful.
Yeah. Living in northern Minnesota, a lot of people, there's wolves, gray wolves in northern Minnesota. And a lot of people were like, aren't you worried about the wolves? And, because I had horses that I brought up there and I'm like, are you kidding? A healthy deer can kill a wolf with one kick. So so no, actually not. My horses are healthy, so I'm not worried. And we never ever had any kind of negative encounters with wolves.
Yeah.
But deer, I know that they can certainly kick. I've encountered them in the wild where either I was a little too close or something and they stamped and snorted a little bit. I've seen it with does. And certainly, of course, I think everybody's probably very familiar with a deer running away in fear and flagging their tail back and forth as probably a warning to other deer. I think that's what that is. Warning to, hey, there's something over here you should be worried about. And the other thing, when I was out at the barn the other night, and they have electric fence, that is 5 feet, something.
Right over that.
That is like, they can stand right next to it and jump over it. It is amazing that they can jump so high, whether they're running really fast. I've seen them go between the strands of not barbed wire, but between the strands of electric wire too, without even thinking about it. Or at least that's what it looks like to me. It's just like, there's no hesitation. They just go. So that is pretty amazing adaptation. And I think it's for getting away from predators.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Needs to be, right?
Yeah. Or getting stuck in fences, which seems to happen a lot too. So I don't know.
Yeah, we've rescued several bucks that have gotten tangled in wire, gotten tangled in rope, or gotten, during the fall and they're rubbing on everything. And this is not a podcast today anyway about rescue, but that's kind of a dicey rescue to help them out, to get them free. This was the first part of my in-depth discussion with wildlife rehabilitator and naturalist Debbie Sykes of the Nashville Wildlife Conservation Center. Next episode, we get into the topic of public interaction with white-tailed deer fawns. Now, deer fawns are more resilient than they appear to be, but to an unskilled observer, they often think that they're orphaned. This often leads to inappropriately taking them in for rescue, a phenomena I often call the Bambi syndrome. I think it's those big brown eyes that make people believe that they're orphaned. That, and they're not familiar with white-tailed deer natural history. It's another interesting and important aspect of caring for white-tailed deer, so you won't want to miss it. This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. Our producer is Kirk Clockey. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit raptor.umn.edu. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.